the Lord said, Amos, what do you see? And I said, a plumb line. And the Lord said, behold, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them. The high places of Isaac will be made desolate. The sanctuaries of Israel will be laid to waste. I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. So something to emphasize there is we see 2 times where Amos begs for God to relent from the specific judgment that he said will arise, and he does. But then we have that vision of a plumb line. So I want to ask, what is a plumb line, and what does it do? I know I didn't put that in your questions for homework, but off the top of your head, does anybody know what a plumb line is or what you use it for? Hey, Jack?
It's like a old way of setting level. You can use it because it's just a weight on the string. It will always eventually set level to where you want to build everything else off of it. It essentially sets a gradient for you to run anything else.
Yeah, so you use it in your construction. And it's kind of, honestly, it's like an old version of Jesus' parable of the wise man who builds his house on the rock. If you build something and it's not plumb or it's not straight, you will eventually watch it fall over, or it will not be a sound structural thing. So here, Amos is emphasizing the point that you have a standard that you should be following. Coming back to over and over how he's saying you should know the Lord, know his teachings. Here, the Lord is emphasizing, I'm going to hold you accountable to those standards, to those teachings. And then talks about the judgment that will come as a result of not being straight or not being plumb. So that will tie in as well. So I think we have one more section I wanted to get to before we get back to question number 1 that we've taken a long time on our detour. Chapter 8, I'll grab verses 11 and 12 real quick, but someone go over to chapter 9. I'll give you your verses in just a sec. Chapter 8, he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord God, where I will send a famine on the land, but not a famine of bread, nor of thirst for water, but for hearing the words of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea, from north to east. They shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, but they shall not find it. So this is near the end of Amos's prophecies. And, 2 sections here. The first one we talked about the Lord relenting on some of his judgments, but judgment will still arrive. And then as Jack read, the guy who asked Amos to stop prophesying, but in his visions, we've seen that, we skipped the one of the fruit for the sake of time, but he also compares them to being a basket of fruit that's overripe for judgment, to get that image home. But here, we saw in chapter 8 also that if they're not going to listen to the Lord, he will stop talking to them, is kind of one of his final threats or judgments here. So, to finish out the book, we got 2 sections left. I want someone to read verses 1 through 4 of chapter 9, and then when they're done, someone to finish out 10 to the end of the book, the last 5 verses.
By the altar, and he said, strike the doorposts and the thresholds and shake, and break them on the heads of them all, and I will slay the last of them with the sword. He who flees from them shall not get away, and he who escapes from them shall not be delivered. Though they dig into hell, from there my hand shall take them. Though they climb up to heaven, from there I will bring them down. Though they hide themselves on top of Carmel, from there I will search and take them. Though they hide from my sight at the bottom of the sea, from there I command the serpent, and it shall bite them. Though they go into captivity before their enemies, from there I will command the sword, and I shall slay them. I will set my eyes on them for harm, not for.
All right, and then if someone could finish out the book, verses 10 to the end.
Of my people shall die by the sword, who say disaster shall not overtake or meet us. In that day I will raise up the booth of David that is fallen, repair its breaches, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine, and they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them on their land, and they shall never again be uprooted out of the land that I have given them, says the Lord your God.
All right, thank you. So now that we've kind of got a summary of the whole book, back to question 1. How would you summarize Amos's overall message? What's the point he's trying to get across?
Judgment with purpose.
Okay.
Right? Like there, again and again, it is hammered down. You're going to be punished and nothing's going to stop that. I mean, that's a large portion, right? Just of what we just read in chapter 9. It's like, I don't care what happens to you. You're not escaping God's judgment. But at the same time, he uses this, I think it's really cool terminology of the plowman overtaking the reaper. He's like, I'm going to demolish everything because I am starting anew, right? I'm going to bring about a new Israel, a new law. I'm going to replant, and it's going to be even greater than the first. And you guys are the ones that are going to basically build that foundation with your deaths at this point.
Yeah, 100%. Any other thoughts on how you would summarize Amos's overall message of his book?
For those who are at ease in Zion is the verse that chapter 6 opens with. So, as you've noted, this is a time of physical prosperity at the time of Jeroboam II. And outwardly, things might be looking good, but they had become corrupt of heart and were willing to oppress their brethren and stomp on whatever they could and disregard God's ways so that they could get back stomping on their brethren and wanted to hurry up with the feast and the special days so that they could get back to making their money, their ill-gotten gain. And so they were corrupt of heart, and God was going to take care of that.
Yeah, we've seen the strong dangers of complacency and kind of growing deaf to the messages that were being preached to them while still wanting to see themselves as holy or God's people. One of the things I was thinking about as reading the book is it really seems like Amos's message to me is God has delayed as much as he possibly can delay judgment. Because we know verses about like how mercy triumphs over judgment, about how the Lord is patient, not willing that any should perish. And Amos has really shown that to me, because even though it's a book that's very strong in its judgment, every time it's being brought up, like especially at the start of the book, we've seen like, I could have condemned you at transgression 3, but we're on transgression 4, is figuratively. And then how he shows over and over, like, you're a basket of overripe fruits. Like, long ago, you could have faced judgment, but I've waited past the point that I could have or should have for judging you. It seems to me like he's almost saying, like, we know God is a perfectly loving God and a perfectly just God, and he has waited as long as he can, and to continue to tolerate that would be starting to sacrifice the just God side of the scale, if that makes sense. The second question I asked on that is, how does Amos's tone shift throughout the book? What did you guys see about his message, how it kind of changes emphasis as we went through the chapters? Or do you think it was consistent and just kind of steady-handed the whole time?
You see that glimpse of something better coming that obviously has reference to the spiritual kingdom, and we know that because the New Testament references back to this, but in chapter 9, verses 11 and 12 in particular, that he's going to raise up the tabernacle of David. You know, there's this remnant, and the Gentiles are going to be called in to seek the Lord as well. And so here's a great promise that's coming about, that God's still going to reign, he's still going to have a people, but there's going to be a new emphasis who's going to be the king.
Yeah, it is almost surprising after how bleak the book is for it to end in such a positive way. So that's definitely a huge shift in the tone. What other things did you guys pick up as we were going through it?
For kind of chapter 7, when Amos is cast out, I more see just a shift in, like before then, there's a lot that talks about like repentance and, oh God, you know, don't punish them this way. Well, you relent. And then after Amos is rejected, you don't see as much of that anymore. And it's like, no, they need to be punished, right? Like, you've rejected everything at this point. There is no relenting from this punishment. There's nobody advocating for you anymore to not be punished, to get away with this. That's it. And that was your last chance, kind of thing.
Yeah. And that was one that surprised me kind of reading through it because, like, it sometimes we read through scripture and we just kind of take it as it is, in the sense that we might not question why was Amos so harsh in chapter 4, but then so begging God for mercy in chapter 7. But if we read through it as like a human from that lens, kind of like trying to see Amos through the scriptures, chapter 7 really did surprise me getting to that after seeing how aggressively he's going after Israel to get to chapter 7, and then God says, okay, I have these judgments prepared, and he's begging, please relent. How can Jacob stand? He is so small. Which to me is kind of impressive on two fronts, because Israel throughout this book, they're kind of at one of their relative peaks of power. They're strong at this time. But his plea is, Jacob is so small. How can he stand? So what seems kind of like my inference of it is the judgment that he saw must have been so strong, so severe, that even though he doesn't like Israel, even though he sees their sins, even though they are strong, it's so overwhelming compared to what they are. And, just relying on God's mercy and God's love, because there's nothing redeeming in Israel itself right now, but God is a holy God and a loving God, so just begging that can be factored into the judgment, so to speak. One thing Jack just got reminded of me is this section right here. So chapter 7, that first 8 verses there, when we're looking at the judgment that the Lord had prepared, the first one is basically like, hey, you've just planted your crops and we're going to eat everything green in the land with locusts and you're going to starve. The second one, I'm not entirely sure what it is, but obviously not great if the Lord is calling for judgment by fire on you. So the question I wanted to ask on that is, where else in the scriptures have we seen God kind of do a clean slate, or express the desire to do that, of just wiping out all the sin and starting over? Where have we seen that before? I hear some whispers. I didn't hear anything loud enough. The flood? Okay. That was one of the two I was thinking of. There might be more, but I thought of two. You guys remember a second time? Yeah. Okay, yeah, I didn't think about that one. That's a very good point. Another situation where you see sin has just risen to a level that is just unacceptable. Sodom and Gomorrah is actually a great one I hadn't thought about, because that does parallel this same kind of begging for any reduction in it. What I was actually thinking of was kind of back to Moses interceding for the people. It seemed to be a very similar situation. Not to answer my own question, I want to get you guys talking more. In those moments, why did God call for judgment? And in the one for Moses, why did he relent? I know I'm kind of asking you something that I didn't prepare you for ahead of time, but just high level, do you guys remember in those passages, what were the reasons he gave for the flood? What were the reasons he gave for Sodom and Gomorrah, or wanting to wipe out the people with Moses?
God would have been within his right, certainly, to have not relented when it came to Moses. So it's worth just mentioning that God would have been righteous either way.
Yes, yeah.
So he chose to regard Moses and what Moses did, standing between God and Israel, or standing before God on behalf of Israel, is what it was.
Yeah, 100%. And that's something we've seen in Amos 2 as well, is just that God is well within his rights to express judgment, but he is often patient beyond what he is justified in doing in giving judgment. Yeah.
Getting at, but there's an intercessor that goes to God, right? And is righteous with them. They are usually the righteous individual, and they're saying, God, please give them yet another chance, right? Allow me to take upon, like with Moses' case in Exodus 32, he says, blot me out of the book that you have written to save these people. And there's this idea, or this very prophetic idea, of someone who is willing to take on the sins of others to provide for their redemption and give them another chance at salvation.
Yeah, 100%. And I was thinking, back to the flood, that instance does seem to strongly parallel what we see in Amos here. Because back in Genesis, it'll talk about how the people's thoughts were on evil continually, and there was not any thought of righteousness or godliness. And then when we look at, I should have got my scriptures ahead of time, but I think it's Peter who talked about Noah as a preacher of righteousness. So not the thought that he's just quietly in this corner building an ark to save himself, but like he's actually sharing to some degree, we don't know all the details, but trying to be an influence for good in a wicked world. So to me, that seemed to parallel Amos a lot, where you have someone pleading with people to get their attention, but they don't listen and judgment arrives anyway. But then through that judgment, a very small remnant is kind of carried through. Yeah, Dennis?
In the Exodus account also, there, if you take that one, there's the back and forth between God and Moses is a lot of Moses saying, if you destroy us all, what is everybody going to think? And that's not how he puts it exactly, but he's like, you've already said you're going to do all these great things. And now if we get destroyed, like people will, like they won't appreciate who you are.
Yeah.
And it's actually, it's fascinating to me, but in Exodus 13, verse 13, as Moses is making the argument, he says, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants to whom you swore by your own self. And he actually uses a very similar phrase in Amos 6:8, when it says the Lord God has sworn by himself. And so there's kind of that idea of God. I'm not sure I know how to say it. It's this idea of like God truly presenting himself as he is. And so we've said a lot of things about that, like God is always just, God is always righteous, God is always gracious. And you kind of see that in these phrases where basically God is making the most ultimate vow he can by himself and his own name to accomplish these different things.
Yeah. You said some of my thoughts better than I could, so I'll leave it with Dennis there. But I do want to get on to some of the other questions we asked, since we're already at 30 minutes. The second question I asked you was, looking at Amos's teachings, which is more important, the spirit of the law or the letter of the law? So maybe to put it a little bit differently, what's more important, your actions or your heart? It's kind of a different way of asking that same question. Yeah, Phil?
This one's one that we've got to be careful how we answer and our attitudes toward it, because I can't help but think of James. And he says, show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. And I believe it's the same principle there. Yes, you can serve the letter of the law without actually having any thought behind it, not having your heart in it, and that's not right. But show me how to have the spirit of the law without having the letter of the law, and I'll show you I understand the spirit and the principle of the law by fulfilling every detail that God wants me to do.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I was hoping to get a little bit more of the thoughts on both sides, but yeah, that is kind of the end point, is that you need both. Go ahead, Jack.
I just thought all the way back even to Cain and Abel is what this question reminded me of. Instinctively, you almost want to say like the spirit of the law, but the central idea to all of God's teachings and a relationship with God from the very beginning is that loving the spirit of the law necessitates that you follow the law to the letter, right? That's kind of that's the idea behind it. So I think back to Cain and Abel, where even though we don't have exactly what was told or written out to them, there's an understanding that Cain was trying, maybe upholding the spirit of the law and offering a sacrifice, but it still wasn't right because Abel offered a sacrifice that was pleasing to God. And so, well, they both offered a sacrifice, right? They both had the spirit of what God wanted, but there's an exact way to serve God the way he wants us to.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this question? Yeah, Dennis?
The second thing is in Hosea 6, when Hosea is prophesying, God says, through him, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But the next verse says, but like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. So you have God saying, what I really want is for you to love me. So that's the spirit of the law. But then he says, but you're not doing the law, right? So he's condemning them for that also. And I think it speaks to like the vision of the plumb line, like there's a standard here. And so you have to have both. And I think Amos is just, God is bringing forth one or the other throughout Amos, depending on the point he wants to make at the exact time in the book.
Yeah. And I'm not going to teach a class without giving you at least one trick question to make you think a little bit. But as I was reading through Amos, the reason I wanted to ask that question is because in my read through Amos, to me it seemed like he was much more emphasizing their diligence to the letter of the law at the cost of the spirit to the law. So this book, like if we look at chapter 4, the first 5 verses, he's talking about, like, especially look at verse 4 and 5 there, where he's telling them, come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and multiply your transgressions. That very sarcastic, bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days, and goes to list more things. And he says, for so you love to do, O people of Israel. And if we jump ahead to like chapter 5, looking at verses 21 through 25, we read this last time and today as well, where he talks about, I despise your feasts. I take no delight in your assemblies, no delight in your animal sacrifices, your hymns. And in verse 24, his rebuke is, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Because that ties to chapter 8. The last section I wanted to go for this thought is, I think Phil's already alluded to this, but in chapter 8, verses 4 through 6, he says, hear this, you who trample on the needy, and bring the poor of the land to an end, who say, when will the new moon be over, that we can sell grain, and the Sabbath, that we can sell wheat, that we may make an ephah and a small, the shekel great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and sell the needy for a pair of sandals, and sell the chaff of the wheat. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. And goes on to talk about the judgment that will come. But here we see whether they're trying to tread this line of, how can I technically follow the Sabbath? How can I technically follow the law of Moses, even though they do break it in some sections? But trying to keep that appearance of godliness while totally forgetting the point of what it was supposed to accomplish. Hey, Dennis?
But this last week that even when God is saying that, they weren't doing those things. Like they weren't keeping the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Like they were doing their own version of the Sabbath because it's up in Israel. It's Jeroboam's religion. So it's not even the law of Moses. So there's this whole undercurrent as God keeps saying to them, like, go ahead and make more sacrifices. That's cool. Like, I don't care. They're not even making Mosaic law sacrifices. So like even those are corrupted. So even if they got to the right point where they thought we need to be more focused on God, they're still even doing the wrong things.
Yeah, that's something that I guess I appreciate you bringing that up because I haven't emphasized that as much. But the kind of point of question too I was trying to get at is Amos will show what happens if you go commands only and neglect the spirit entirely, and as Dennis has pointed out, not even truly follow the commands. And then as Phil has kind of counterbalanced that we see elsewhere in scriptures, we'll see the danger of going spirit only and neglecting the commands. So it's a situation where you need both. Like you can't have one without the other and think you're in a good standing with God. Any other thoughts on question 2 before we keep going?
Corinthians says that the letter of the law killeth, so, and the spirit gives life. So I thought about that with your question you had.
Yeah. I had a kind of a shotgun blast of verses that I don't think we'll have time for, but yeah, 2 Corinthians, 3:6 has that same thought. It's something you see all throughout Romans as well as that emphasis on the Spirit, but that'll probably be a bigger conversation than we have time for in 10 minutes here. But yeah, the key point of you need both fundamentally. You can't have one without the other. Okay, so question 3 I asked you had 2 parts. You can answer either. The first one I asked is, after God's restoration, after judgment, what are some things they thought God was going to do that he didn't? And then kind of the flip side, what are some things God did that they didn't expect that he would do? So I know we haven't really read passages about what happens after this judgment, but based on what you know of the scripture or like jumping ahead to some of our classes on Luke, what's kind of the 2 sides of that coin that we see with the people's response to judgment?
Chapter 5, especially the end, made me think a lot of our class in Luke and the things Jesus continually says to them. And this idea of, you guys should probably stop asking for God's day of judgment to come because you're the ones who are going to get judged the harshest, right? Like if God's judgment came right now, none of you would make it, right? Like that's kind of the idea of Amos 5. And I think that that kind of ties into their perpetual misunderstanding of the law that, God's always gonna just swoop in and save us and kill all our enemies. And, this is Amos and then Jesus telling them, no, you guys are going to be judged even more harshly than those you look down upon because you had the relationship and you fumbled.
What other thoughts?
The book of Amos, like from verse 11 in chapter 9 down, like I think there was an expectation that all those things described there would be fulfilled very literally and like to the greatest physical degree that they possibly could. So there was a vision of us restoring to the Davidic kingdom and our mightiness and all these things.
Yeah, that was definitely what I was thinking about with the first part of, as we, really hammered that point home, I feel like every other Luke class, of how they were expecting that physical kingdom, but it was a spiritual one. And then also what I was thinking with that second one, things they weren't expecting God to do, is if we look at the start of Amos, he spent all that time prophesying judgment on all the nations around him, saying God sees the sins of all these other people and he will hold them accountable. And, if it's someone with a Jonah kind of mindset, you might cheer a little bit and think like, yeah, like those people who are evil are going to get what's coming to them. But then the end of the book, included in these restoration verses about Israel, he includes the other nations, like not by name, but he talks about, verse 12 or verse 13, he talks about that idea that this restoration of this remnant is not Israel exclusive. Like, yes, you are God's chosen people, but there's kind of a hint of what Jesus keeps running into with the Jews of the day, where they hold that mindset of, well, this should only be for us, but instead it's coming to all the people of the earth. Okay, so Jack already dove a little bit into question 4. How are the righteous people supposed to see the day of the Lord? If you need some hints, go back to chapter 5, and that kind of verse 13 to 18 section he was reading. Day of the Lord, good thing, bad thing, exciting, terrifying? What was the correct attitude towards it? Hey, Jack.
I think what's really brought out there is that there should be a lot of sorrow within that day, because I think at least my takeaway is whether or not you yourself are judged rightly, there are many being condemned by that judgment. And that should make you sorrowful. That should be something very sad to witness and see happening. And it should not be a day of like just it's amazing. Look how our enemies are being trampled, like the Israelites wanted it to be. It should be like, no, it's going to be a day of doom and gloom a little bit, because lots of people are getting it.
Yeah, I think the book of Amos actually is paired really nicely with the book of Jonah that we just read, because that's one of the things that we've kind of seen Jonah trip over, is almost like expecting the wicked to face judgment and finding some satisfaction in that. And Amos has had that point in the section Jack read, and there's another section we didn't read today, but kind of that thought of, even you who are righteous should not be looking forward to the day of the Lord. Like, yes, wickedness will be judged, but that is coming at a very high cost, and it's not a happy thing or a thing to look forward to. So with the last bit of time, I kind of rushed to this last question here because I want to hear your thoughts. What modern day applications or things we can draw from this book to pull to ourselves have you found from the book of Amos? What have been some things you've learned or some takeaways?
I think one is the honesty to hold ourselves up to God's standard always. And so I get that with the plumb line, and then with God's critiques of the nation about how they were worshiping. And it's this idea that even though in that one section where God relents from basically completely destroying them, he still says, okay, but the standard is still the standard, right? And that's what I'm still holding everyone accountable to. I'm not loosening judgment here because, well, they've been unrighteous for hundreds of years. He still expects them to go back and do the things that God has commanded. And so application-wise, it's easy to drift And so you've always got to be going back to the one source.
Yeah, that's a huge one. What others?
One of my takeaways is God's expectations were not limited to the Israelites. So, their expectations of all the nations that's around.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Yeah, Jack.
Let's see, that chapter like 8, 4 through 6 especially made me think a lot about kind of a simple point, but just are we making God's worship distinct in our minds from the rest of our life? Like, even if it's just a simple thing, like, I can't wait for church to be over today so I can go do what I want to do, or I gotta do my hour of Bible study so I can go to the other things I want to do. Like, is my worship to God, my service to God, like something I segregate into a little box, and that's what I'm doing? Because that's what God specifically calls out here. Is you guys are like waiting for my worship to end so you can go sin. And I think that's a very applicable attitude, at least for me. Right? I can fall into that trap of like, this is my time for God, my time for me, kind of thing. It's all supposed to overlap.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Is being a Christian the core part of who you are, or is it something kind of tacked on to the side and do it when it's time for it or convenient? Any others? One of the ones, I've got a few, I don't think I'll have time to go through all of them. One of the ones I was thinking about for myself, at least going through the book of Amos, kind of on the last thought we got there, is kind of the idea of being careful in why we ask for judgment. Because, like, yes, we have verses about, judgment is the Lord's, he will repay. And it's good to keep that in its proper place of asking the Lord to be the one to execute judgment and not bringing that for myself. But what I was thinking about reading through this book is, like, when I ask that, when I see something evil or see something corrupt in the world and I ask for God's judgment on it, what's my motive or what's my heart in the matter? Because what I was realizing myself is, like, maybe kind of a 50-50 split on it. Maybe half the time when I'm asking for God to judge something evil, it's because I am upset of how, like maybe it's something that's taken Christianity and it's twisted it into a selfish or perverse, and I'm upset because of how it's distorted God's church or God's holiness. But then the other half of the time I've kind of realized when I'm upset and asking for God's judgment on something, it can be kind of for selfish or worldly reasons. Like, why did that person get to commit these crimes and get ahead and not face punishment? That really has nothing spiritual to it. Like, yes, it's a sin, but my point is, it's kind of easy to fall into the same mistake that we see the Jews in the New Testament we talk about a lot falling into, of trying to make God's kingdom a physical kingdom, being upset about earthly things instead of being focused on spiritual things. So for me, that was kind of a big takeaway or something to keep in my mind whenever I'm concerned about those things. All right, any others in the last few minutes we have? Because I've got one more. No one else wants to share. Okay. If not, one sec, sorry. I realized kind of reading through this book is in a similar tone to that first one I shared. For me, it's often discouraging or frustrating to see the amount of evil that continues to persist in the world and thinking, where is God? Why is he not doing anything about it? Does he not see it? And to me, that's been another thing that's been good to read Amos for, is because Amos shows time and time again through the other nations, through Israel, through Judah, that he's not blind to their sins. He's patient. And that judgment is not something to be looked forward to, but something that we ought to try to help people avoid. Not in the sense that, as Amos has said, you can be strong enough or smart enough or rich enough to avoid it, but in the sense that the only way to avoid judgment is by aligning ourselves with God's standards, with his will, by being obedient to him. So, yes, justice is the Lord's, he will repay, but it's not something to cheer on. He needs us to do good, to be his prophets, to be his messengers, to help pull as many people out of judgment as we can, to pull as many people as we can to God's home that he's prepared. Kind of the very end of Amos, that spark of hope is what we have today, where he's talked about, the great blessings that he'll provide so many you can't keep up with them. The land that, as verse 15 hits at, the land that he's given that they will never be taken out of again. Not a physical kingdom, but as we talk about over and over and over, that spiritual kingdom that we look forward to. So a little bit of a ray of hope at the end of Amos. I think it's still very applicable today. And that's all the thoughts I had for for class this morning. So thank you guys for your thoughts, for the readings, and your time. And we'll look forward to, I think, Ken, do you have the next class? All right, look forward to that.